thank you for that very warm welcome. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here and to see so many people who are interested in what's going on in Africa and in the rest of the world. Before I say anything about tonight's topic of discussion, and I hope it will be a discussion, I have some few points I want to make to begin the discussion. I hope that everybody will then make their contribution and we can discuss some of these very, very important issues. But before I do that, I just want to thank the organizers of this event, particularly Dr. Afua Cooper, who I have known and worked with for last 3 or 4 years, and who has already anyway received an extensive introduction from Isaac. I won't anyway repeat that. I don't want to embarrass her any further. But I just would say that I believe that Dalhousie University is extremely fortunate to have Afua Cooper in its midst. Far be it from me to lecture anybody, but I hope they appreciate exactly who they have, because Afua is anyway, not just an internationally known scholar, performer, but as a human being, it's a very special human being. So it's my great privilege and honor, pleasure to know her, and I'm very, very happy to come and speak tonight. And I thank her for welcoming me. And I must say also that not just to thank her, but also to thank her two daughters, Alami and Habiba, who also welcomed me into their home during my visit and made me extremely welcome. So I want to thank you, both of you as well, for your anyway, for your kindness, and for your welcome. I have to also thank just 1 or 2 other people I think it's important to thank. Isaac is also an old friend, I could say, and the last time I came to Halifax, it was Isaac's invitation, but he's also welcomed me, taken me around, introduced me to people, looked after me, and assisted in as Afua said, assisted in the organising of the event. So my thanks also go to him. I also have to thank Denise Allen, I think is here, who played a very important part in bringing me to Dalhousie, in the sense that she picked me up at the airport. And without her, the 2 people I mentioned, I've just given these anyway, great accolades to, are nowhere to be seen. It was Denise who picked me up when nobody else was bothered to pick me up. So and I'm not known to be controversial. And last but not least, I have to thank Alia Said, who again welcomed me. I could say literally welcomed me with open arms, and with anyway, an openness and a friendship that anyway, it was extremely refreshing and meant a lot to me, and went kind of beyond the call of duty, bringing me late at night, even bringing me pillows. It's amazing what you can get with a quick message on Facebook these days. Anyway, who I won't go on and tell you all the things she brought me because it will only embarrass her, possibly embarrass me as well. But she also has played a very important role in welcoming me here, and I thank her and I thank all of those I've mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to say something about contemporary events in Africa. As you heard, I'm a historian by training, but I am concerned about contemporary issues, events, not only in Africa, but globally, but particularly in Africa. And the title of tonight's presentation is, I think, is White Man's Burden, New Scramble for Africa. So I thought, well, first we must establish exactly what we're talking about. If we're going to have that kind of title, what does it mean exactly? So this is quite a sort of pictorial representation of the concept, you could say. In the 19th century, the major European powers justified their imperial conquests, the division, the exploitation of Africa and other parts of the world with various high-sounding phrases. They talked of the white man's burden. They talked about their civilizing mission. In some cases, they argued that Europe had a dual mandate, presumably from God, who had given the various European powers the power of trusteeship over the allegedly inferior peoples of the world, including those of Africa. The idea was that they had been given jurisdiction to govern, to exploit, and particularly to exploit the resources of the African continent. So they said, for the benefit of humanity, by which of course they meant the monopolies of the countries of Europe and various other parts of the world. And one of the key factors, of course, in all this, that it was done in the interests of Africa and Africans, but Africans were not consulted about any of these invasions, conquests, and so on. And the idea of the civilizing mission and white man's burden was immortalized in the famous poem by Kipling. And I haven't put the whole poem up, but just to give you a brief snatch. I think this is the first verse of the poem. So in short then, Europe was not exploiting and conquering Africa in its own economic interests. Rather, it was taking on a burden of civilizing an inferior race, perhaps ending slavery, bringing the benefits of Christianity, of civilization, of commerce, and so on. Of course, at other times, this notion of a civilizing mission or some burden that Europe and others were taking up was expressed in more openly racist terms. And the well-known imperialist Cecil Rhodes said, speaking of the English, he said, "We are the best race in the world. And the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Every acre added to our territory means the birth of more of the English race who otherwise would not be brought into existence." So there were those who expressed things rather more bluntly, blatantly. But the point about all of these ideas was that they assumed that Africans were inferior, to be treated as wards, children, animals, to be civilized if that was possible, because it was assumed that this civilizing mission would take some time. But of course not to be consulted. Colonial rule, after all, was always enforced and impose through violence, but also with many sweet words. To coin a well-known phrase, it was imposed with the Bible and with the gun. There was a saying amongst Africans that when Europeans first came to Africa, Europeans had the Bible and Africans had the land. Then they said the missionaries told everybody to close their eyes and pray, and when they opened their eyes, the Africans had the Bible and the Europeans had the land. The Emperor of Ethiopia, Emperor Theodore, said, I know their game. First it's traders and missionaries, then it's ambassadors, then they bring the guns. We shall do better to go straight to the guns. And of course in his case they did go straight to the guns, unfortunately. So these ideas of the white man's burden, civilizing mission and so on were particularly prevalent at the time of the so-called Scramble for Africa. This idea of a scramble was coined by the Times newspaper to describe the events surrounding the infamous Conference of Berlin in 1884-1885, but the scramble between the major European powers for African territory took obviously longer. It's generally considered that it was most intense in the last quarter of the 19th century and spilled over into the period leading up to the First World War. It was, in short, the partition and conquest of the continent. The French Prime Minister called it a giant steeplechase into the unknown. The Belgian King, Leopold, put it in a different way and demanded his share of this magnificent African cake. The partition of the continent, the scramble for its resources, was justified by the notion of the white man's burden and the civilizing mission and so on, but of course also by the principle that might is right, that the big imperialist powers had might on their side and therefore they could justify things in any way they wanted. So it's worth just staying on the Leopold track for a moment. We think about Leopold and his cake, because he was aided by the gentleman that you see here, Henry Stanley. And Stanley had boasted to the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce in England of the gateway that he'd opened up for them through his explorations of the African continent. And he said, there are 40 million people beyond the gateway, and the cotton spinners of Manchester are waiting to clothe them. Birmingham's foundries are glowing with the red metal that should presently be made into ironwork in every fashion and shape for them, and the trinkets that shall adorn those dusky bosoms. In short, Africa was seen as a great market for Europe's goods, a place to invest, and a source of raw materials. Some, of course, if not many, exploited the African continent to the point of excess. What was later known as the Belgian Congo was initially ironically known as the Congo Free State and was administered as essentially a private domain by King Leopold. It was used for the production of rubber, and terrible atrocities were committed in order to gather this rubber and to force people to participate in Leopold's Free State. It's estimated that between 1880 and 1920, the population of the Congo was halved. It's now estimated that possibly 10 million people were slaughtered during that period. Such was the scandal of the civilizing mission, the white man's burden in the Congo, that it was taken out of the hands of the Belgian king and administered after that by the Belgian government. Although, of course, this didn't stop the exploitation of the people of that region. And as you well know, and I'll say more about this later, that the Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has continued to be exploited by the big imperialist powers. to lose many more millions of its population in the modern, new scramble for Africa's resources. Perhaps I should just explain that picture. In punishment for not gathering enough rubber, people had their limbs amputated by the colonial authorities. So the scramble, the old 19th century scramble for Africa's colonies and Africa's resources, resulted not just in such crimes and in the impoverishment of Africa, but also, of course, in the economic development of the big powers. It also contributed to the rivalry which spilled over into the First World War. It should be added that the scramble itself, the necessity for the colonial powers to literally conquer these territories, was also in some ways a response to African resistance, but also the growing contention between the big powers. The fact that they were developing at different rates, new powers were emerging, Germany, US, Italy and others, who all wanted their piece of the cake. And of course, most importantly, it heralded the arbitrary division and artificial borders of the African continent, some of which still exist today. And here you can see the partition. People are probably familiar with this, but it led to various anomalies. One of them being, you have countries here like Gambia, Guinea to some extent. Gambia is essentially a river, which the British wanted to hang on to, even though it's surrounded by a French territory. And so nations were arbitrarily divided, borders were drawn on maps by Europeans in Europe without any consultation with anybody in Africa and so on. The scramble, and it's worth mentioning that these divisions, these artificial borders, still plague the African continent in various ways, and have created all kinds of artificial states and so on and so forth. And of course the scramble heralded the period of colonial rule, which some countries in Africa are only just emerging from, or only emerged from in the last few years. Indeed, the whole of the 20th century for Africa has been mainly a struggle to extricate itself from colonial rule and from its legacy. Although it has to be said that even with political independence that came to many countries in the 1960s, 1970s, Africa still faces many problems connected with what Kwame Nkrumah termed neo-colonialism. Okay, so all that is just by way of introduction, so you know what I'm talking about tonight. That's all old history, 19th century, 20th century. Okay, so let's talk about the 21st century. So today, in the 21st century, following many years engaged in casting off the shackles of colonialism, Africa stands poised, some say, to break free from economic dependency and all the legacies of colonial rule. Just to give you some statistics, in the past 10 years, 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing countries were African. And you can see some of these on the chart here. Look at the fastest growing countries here, both in the decade 2001 to 2010, but also the projected growth rates. Africa's population is also expected to grow immensely in the next few years. It's estimated that it will provide half of the world's increase in population in the next 40 years. So Africa's population will double from go up from about 1 billion to 2 billion, I think, something like that. And it will also have an increasingly large section of that population that will be kind of middle income, you could say. So in other words, it will be comparable in economic terms to India, or potentially comparable to India. It already has, for example, over 600 million cell phone users, and cell phones being used in Africa to conduct all kinds of business, as well as obvious simple communication and so on. It's now said that the richest person of African origin in the world is no longer Oprah, but the cement king of Nigeria, Aliko Dangote, who I think is worth 10 billion or something. In 8 of the past 10 years, Africa has grown faster than East Asia. I think about a 6% growth on average is reported for this year. Some countries are growing very much faster than that, as you can see. And even the World Bank has reported that Africa could be on the brink of some kind of economic takeoff, in a similar way as that experienced by China and India in the past. However, although there's no doubt that many of Africa's economies are developing rapidly, it has to be borne in mind they start from a very low level, many of them. The continent in general is still dependent on external investment, which has increased massively, about 500% in the last 10 years. And it still faces many problems in terms of distribution of wealth. It's still importing food. Per capita, people produce less now than they did in 1960 and so on. So I'm not presenting it as everything's fine, but just showing some of the indicators of economic development. Okay, at the same time as there are these economic developments, there are important political developments taking place in the continent. Because the generally impoverished people of Africa, and the vast majority of people in Africa live on less than $2 a day. These people are also demanding an end to neo-colonial arrangements and all the consequences of neoliberal globalization. It cannot be forgotten that what the media and the big powers like to call the Arab Spring actually began in Africa. The uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt in particular, were, whatever spin is put on it in the media, were uprisings against neocolonialism, against globalization and their consequences. And they were waged against the neocolonial rulers such as Mubarak, Ben Ali, and so on, who had carried out the bidding of the big powers over the last 35 years and implemented the neoliberal policies of the IMF, World Bank, and so on, which had impoverished their people, brought on mass unemployment, and so on and so forth. For their services, the Mubaraks and others were financed and supported by various countries. Perhaps we shouldn't name them. Perhaps we should. Like the US, for example, that's reported to have given Mubarak about $2 billion a year for the last 35 years to maintain this dictatorial, impoverishing, neo-colonial regime in power. You probably remember that when the uprising began in Tunisia, the French government rushed to support Ben Ali and said, could they assist with more training for the Tunisian police and so on and so forth. The same was true of Egypt, where the big powers talked about orderly transitions and all kinds of expressions whereby they mean nothing much should change. And of course that's the struggle that's going on in Egypt. Is there fundamental change, or is everything more or less the same way as it was before? It's also has to be noted that the big powers have used the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt for their own purposes, and have become now the greatest champions of revolution. if you hear them speaking, they all say, yeah, of course we support revolution. Not in the US, not in Britain, not in Canada, but of course in Egypt and in various other places. So this is what they say. I'm not saying they do, this is what they say. But they use it for their own purposes, as we will see. I'll talk more about Libya. People are also aware of what's going on in Syria and so on. So they use the notion of the Arab Spring actually against the people of North Africa and Western Asia. This is exactly what's going on at the moment. However, this situation I've described, both the economic developments, the political struggles, the possibility of revolutionary change and so on, has intensified the concern of the big powers to dominate the African continent and intensified the rivalry between them. The old imperialist powers have been joined by new rivals: Brazil, Russia, India, and particularly China. And they're all contending for Africa's resources and growing markets, as well as for strategic advantage in the continent. The BRIC countries, as they're known, used to account for about 1% of Africa's trade. Now it's 20%, and it's estimated that by 2030 it could be 50%. The biggest impact has come from China, which has given interest-free loans, buys increasing amounts of Africa's oil and other minerals, has tens of thousands of Chinese workers in Africa, and companies that are beginning to manufacture and so on and so forth. It's interesting to note that in many of the current hotspots, as we could call them, where particularly in those places where the contention between the NATO countries and China are fiercest: Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and elsewhere. Zimbabwe, of course, elsewhere. So the contention, the rivalry between all the big powers to, shall we say, get a piece of the African cake in the 21st century is increasing. So Africa is particularly important for its oil and gas in established areas such as Libya, Nigeria, Guinea, Angola, Chad, etc., but also in new areas: Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Somalia. The Horn of Africa and the Mediterranean remain important for strategic reasons as well. And it's very easy to see this rivalry going on. Off the coast of Sierra Leone, Liberia, you have a US company doing the exploration, US, French, Brazilian and Chinese companies bidding for the drilling rights and so on. The major buyers of Sudan's oil are China, which controls about 67% of it, followed by Japan, India and Malaysia. The old colonial powers, or shall we say, old imperial powers, the Europeans, the US and so on, are catching up in that region. And they were handicapped by the sanctions which the US imposed on Sudan. So now that there is a division of Sudan, the rivalry is still intense. In Libya, the situation is even more complex, particularly after the announcement of the autonomy of the so-called autonomy of the eastern part of the country. But all the biggest oil companies are there, including the national oil companies of China, who it was thought might have been excluded by the invasion, shall we call it, whatever word one wants to use for it, last year. The US currently gets about 15% of its oil from Africa, and this is set to rise to around 25%. So in other words, it will get more of its resources from Africa than from the current Middle East. It's worth mentioning in passing that the major controllers and producers of oil are China, Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others. And it's again, the Western monopolies who are in secondary position. So anyway, the picture again I just want to present is that this rivalry for resources, I just used oil and gas as an illustration, is becoming more and more intense, and Africa more and more important as a supplier of these products. The resource wars, of course, are just one component of the scramble, because Africa is also important for, if you like, the export for investment. It used to be called the export of capital, they call it investment. And increasingly also is a market for goods. It supplies significant amounts of chrome, coltan, cobalt, gold, oil, gas, diamonds, etc., etc. The most obvious scramble, I suppose, would be, again, over the Congo. The Congo itself, which has uranium, cobalt, coltan, gold, diamonds, you name it, and so on, and in which a major war broke out in 1996. Although this war ostensibly was, or we can say involved 7 African countries, all the surrounding countries. Behind the warring countries stood the big monopolies of Canada, US, Britain, France, Belgium, and so on. If you don't believe me, not that you wouldn't believe me, but just in case you didn't believe me, you can go and read the UN report that was released in 2002, and there are many others, which named De Beers, Anglo-American, Euromet, British Aerospace, Oryx, and so on. Now, of course, Barrick Gold, being Canadian, claimed they were not involved in any of this, although everybody thought they were. But there are at least 5 other Canadian monopolies that were involved. So here we have a very, very good example, first of all, of the way the scramble operates. Of course, British Aerospace doesn't have its own people on the ground. It operates through proxies and so on and so forth. So here we have an example of this modern scramble, but we also have an example of course, a kind of genocide that occurred in Congo as a result of those wars. It's estimated that somewhere between 3 and 10 million people died. So just as in the scramble at the end of the 19th century, where we had King Leopold, now we have all the major mineral monopolies engaged in that. But it's also an illustration of what we're always hearing about as typical of Africa and Africans. Of course, always all these wars. How are these wars to be explained? Well, this is how they can be explained. Of course, there are other companies involved who are even murkier than the ones I've mentioned, and they're pretty murky. There's a very interesting company called Executive Outcomes. Anybody ever heard of this? Yeah. And they're connected with another company called Sandline, who were, of course, involved in the Sierra Leone scandal of gun running on behalf of the British government, and so on and so forth. They're also connected with another company known as Heritage Oil, or Heritage Oil and Gas, and another company called Branch Energy, and they're linked to another company called Tullow Oil, and you'll see these guys operating all throughout Africa. They supply mercenaries, anyway. This is what goes on. This is how the scramble operates today. Okay. We'll just take a brief drink. So in some senses then, this scramble I'm talking about is not new. And even at the end of the 20th century it was going on, as the war in the Congo illustrates. But it's definitely intensified in this new century. Again, rather like the 19th century, it's camouflaged between all these honeyed phrases. Tony Blair, for example, used to talk about Africa being a scar on the conscience of humanity, allegedly needing humanitarian intervention of various kinds. And of course, this so-called humanitarian intervention was another way of Britain and its allies intervening in Africa's affairs, and one can go into great detail about how this intervention takes place. Just to use one example, of course, Sierra Leone, I've mentioned sandline, all kinds of things are done, sometimes UN is involved, so on. But when Tony Blair talks about Africa being a scar on the conscience of humanity, he never explains where this scar came from, who created this scar, what are the reasons for it, and so on. And if we just take the case of Sierra Leone as an example, Sierra Leone was Britain's first colony in Africa. It was established as a colony in 1807. It's been more or less a colony or neo-colony for the last 200 years. If intervention by a big power like Britain was so great, why is Sierra Leone in such a state? Why is one of the world's leading diamond producers one of the poorest countries in the world, if intervention was what was required? Similar phrases about humanitarian intervention, humanitarian concern, etc., etc., were mentioned during the recent conference on Somalia by the leaders of Britain, Canada, US, and others. It was very noticeable that suddenly there was this big international conference on Somalia held in London. It's perhaps just coincidental then that there have been recently discovered massive oil fields just off the coast of Somalia. They're anticipated that they're going to be as large as those of Kuwait. Britain is offering all kinds of aid, and behind this aid we understand that BP and Shell are lurking in the wings, as is your own Africa Oil, and which is already drilling in the region, and of course the Chinese state oil company also lurking there, and so on. So behind this alleged humanitarian concern, behind all this talk about aid and concern for Africa and Africans and so on, we see something else going on very, very clearly. Of course, humanitarianism is today presented in all kinds of ways. The white man's burden is presented in a range of forms. Sometimes it's simply aid. And of course, again, some people get confused about this aid because essentially aid is more or less a subsidy, we could say, to the big multinational companies. There's a very famous example of British aid to Tanzania not so many years ago. And then we heard that Tanzania was being asked to buy a £28 million air traffic control system from British Aerospace. This was in 2001. Now some people pointed out that this was a military air traffic control system, and Tanzania didn't really have a military air force as such, or certainly didn't have one that warranted a £28 million system from British Aerospace. There was something of a scandal, and not least because the so-called aid that's given to these countries also has various strings attached to it. Usually the expression is good governance, by which the big powers mean that a political system has to be established which is a bit like the one which exists in Canada or Britain or the US and so on. Now I don't know about people in Canada, but in Britain we're kind of getting a bit fed up with the political system. I believe people in the US are getting fed up with it as well.
Yes, we are.
Okay, so, and we find that it doesn't work that well. So if it doesn't work well in Europe, where it was kind of invented and developed, why should it work well in Africa? why should anybody force Africans to adopt it? So these strings can be and are attached to this so-called aid, which, as I said, is mainly seems to be a subsidy to the big monopolies and so on. There was the other famous example, or infamous example, which again is connected with Tanzania, what Tanzania has done to deserve such treatment, where the British government used so-called aid money to pay an organisation called the Adam Smith International, which is linked to another organisation called the Adam Smith Institute, which is a kind of right-wing think tank, call it. They paid this organisation to lobby and advise the Tanzanian government that they should privatise their water supply, I think in Dar es Salaam. Just so happened that they also suggested that they should employ a British firm to carry out the privatisation. And this was then supported by the World Bank. The World Bank said if it wasn't undertaken, then they wouldn't provide any debt relief to Tanzania and so on. So here we have British government, the World Bank, trying to force Tanzania to privatise its water supply so the British company can make some money and so on. Anyway, all this took place. The privatisation was disastrous. Anyway, it didn't work. There was a big scandal. I think the Tanzanian government took the company to court and sought compensation and so on and so forth. But of course nobody was held account. Nobody resigned from the World Bank, the British government. Nobody was prosecuted. This is how these things work. Of course, the white man's burden today is sometimes presented as the need to export democracy in various places, to encourage the adoption of what the governments of Canada, Britain and the US call universal values, by which they mean their values. And so, as I said, these are again presented as being somehow a burden that the big powers have to go and educate people and encourage them to adopt their political system, their economic system, and so on. Now, what has this got to do with the white man's burden and the modern scramble? I understand this is quite a well-known campaign, and one doesn't want to say anything necessarily about those who are involved in it. But it has to be admitted that it seems to be very closely linked to the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act, which was passed in the US last year. Under this act, the US sent its special forces to Uganda and other parts of Central Africa. And it's interesting that if you read the correspondence, most recent correspondence between these people who call themselves, what do they call themselves? Invisible children. You read their correspondence to the President of the US, they call for more troops to be dispatched to Africa. And in fact, they say that they should be, these American troops should expand their operations in the Central African Republic, in DR Congo, and in South Sudan. Now, of course, one doesn't want to speculate too much about these things, but it seems to me a very good example of, again, the idea of the white man's burden taking on the responsibility to search for a person who, whatever crimes he may have committed, doesn't actually seem very significant these days. And in areas where all sorts of contention is going on, and the US is seeking to expand its military activity. It also strikes me as rather useful propaganda for the US African Command, which, in fact, the dispatch of special forces to Uganda was AFRICOM's second major mission in Africa. Its first major mission was Libya. AFRICOM was established in 2008. Its aim is apparently to safeguard US national interests, as well as dealing with alleged threats in Africa. And it says it is advancing security and stability. If you actually look at what it does, as I say, apart from invading Libya and sending troops throughout Central Africa, it works with the militaries of many African countries. This year, for example, there are about 12 military exercises planned. So these are joint exercises between the US and various African countries. The countries and the areas include Morocco, Cameroon, Mali, East Africa, Lesotho, South Africa, Gabon, North and West Africa, Nigeria, Guinea, Botswana, Uganda, Senegal, and throughout the Maghreb. So it has to be also said that the aim of the African Union, which you know is the Organization of African States, is to have regional military forces. But it now looks as though these 5 regional military forces are actually being trained or actually being connected with the US Army in Africa. So that if ever there is such a thing as a Pan-African army, as was envisaged by Nkrumah and others, it looks like it'll be under US direction, training and control. So then we come to the case of Libya. So we could say that the events in Libya have raised military intervention in Africa under the guise of humanitarianism, taking up the white man's burden, peacekeeping, etc., etc. It's all been raised to a new level, which has significance not only for Africa but for other parts of the world. Of course, we could say that there was a kind of a precedent that perhaps wasn't noticed, that didn't have the same publicity as the events in Libya, and those were the events in Cote d'Ivoire. Because in Cote d'Ivoire, more or less at the same time as the events in Libya, there was intervention by the French and by UN forces, again in a civil conflict, a dispute between 2 politicians and so on, under the guise of protecting civilians. There was an invasion by these French and UN troops. And all the evidence is that they took part in the political struggle that was going on in that country. And of course, one might question why would the French and the French president be so concerned about Africans? Of course, President Sarkozy says that the problem with Africa is, or as he calls it, the tragedy of Africa, is that the African has never really entered history. That reminds me of, what's the famous phrase of Hegel? Africa has no history. So that was the 19th century. We can forgive Hegel, because Hegel said a few things that were not too bad. But Sarkozy is in the 21st century. He's not just some philosopher. He's the president of one of the world's major powers. So that's what he thinks about Africa and Africa. And this is a person who now poses as the greatest friend of the African continent. So yes, so this whole notion of the right to protect, which was the main idea which was promoted in regard to Libya, interesting notion. I know it was originally formulated in Britain, but certainly Blair had what he called his, what do you call it, doctrine of international community, which was this idea of, anyway, intervention linked to the right to protect. It was then developed by your government further, then elaborated by Ban Ki-moon and others to kind of establish it almost as an international law. Of course, it's not an international law. It's actually against international law. It's against the principles of the UN Charter and so on. It's against all the principles the UN was set up for. But it's presented as if this right to protect is something everyone should support and so on and so forth. Of course, the UN was established to effectively to prevent war, and more importantly, to prevent crimes against the peace. But it could be argued that the actions of the big powers in Libya were precisely crimes against the peace, were against the principles of international law and, as I said, the UN Charter. The inciting of rebellion is both a war crime and a crime against the peace. And intervention by external powers is, I think under international law, is only supposed to be utilized if there is a threat to international security and so on, which clearly there wasn't in the case of Libya. So the intervention, the attack, whatever one calls it, on Libya, to me is very, very important and very serious for a number of reasons. We could say that it's an intervention, as this suggests, to to establish perhaps more control over oil. That may be a factor. But of course, Libya was significant for many other reasons. It has a very important strategic position on the Mediterranean. It's one of only 2 countries in the Mediterranean region that was not connected with NATO. It didn't have agreements with NATO, the other being, by just a strange coincidence, Syria. And it was one of only a few African countries that didn't have an agreement with AFRICOM. Libya also had a very important role in Africa as one of the main founders and bastions, we could say, of the African Union. In fact, the African Union was established by the Sète Declaration. And of course, the leader of Libya played a very important role in the financing of the AU and in various other measures to strengthen Africa as an economic unit, to develop its currencies and all these things that you may well be familiar with. It also happened to be the country with the highest standard of living in Africa, and one that had its own, whatever one thinks of it, its own economic and political system. Not one that was imposed from outside or exported from anywhere else. The invasion was also, I think, important because it completely sidelined the AU, the African Union, and unleashed a regime that seemed, particularly in its early days, to be mainly concerned with attacking other Africans and killing them if possible. It's also important, I think, because the intervention in Libya on the basis of the so-called right to protect is now being employed against other countries, such as Syria, and no doubt to be used elsewhere. And in fact, if you read the speeches of major politicians, I don't know about in this country, but certainly in Britain, they keep complaining. If only Syria, the situation in Syria was more like the situation in Libya. If only we could organise the opposition a bit better, as we did in Libya. This is what they say. So it's a very serious illustration, you could say, of this new scramble for position, for control of resources, for domination of the continent, and for undermining also many of the positive developments which are taking place at the continent, as well as the revolutionary events in such places as Tunisia and Egypt. And obviously the big powers and the media in these countries that create all kinds of confusion. What happened in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya is all the same. And it's clearly not all the same. So, I think I've probably spoken for too long. No, please. That's just a kind of courtesy to say that. Doesn't mean So this new scramble for Africa then is spearheaded by the big monopolists, by AFRICOM, by the IMF, by the World Bank, and as we have seen recently, by all kinds of means, military intervention, economic sanctions, and so on. We've seen the hand of the IMF, for example, in the demand to end fuel subsidies in Nigeria and elsewhere in West Africa, allegedly to help the poor of those countries. Of course, it's also interesting to look at what's actually going on in Nigeria. Nigeria seems to be moving closer to China. Nigeria was talking about holding its reserve currencies in the RMB rather than in Western currencies. All kinds of interesting things going on. Just signed a 28 billion deal with the Chinese to build refineries in Nigeria. There are all sorts of interesting developments. But one of the most interesting things about this, this is the head of the central bank in Nigeria, Nigeria's finance minister, chatting, shall we say, to the head of the IMF. The most interesting thing about the IMF intervention in West Africa recently is everybody denied it. Said, no, it's got nothing to do. Nigeria government said, no, we're taking these subsidies off, we've just thought of it. Nobody told us to do it. And the IMF said the same. It's nothing to do with us at all. Gradually it came out what was going on. So the intervention of the IMF in this case was met with the resistance, we can say, of the masses of people in Nigeria who organised their general strike for several days. It's quite a long general strike, which was not completely victorious, but you could say showed the strength of the workers. And I know you guys in Halifax know the strength of the workers, so I don't have to belabor that point, as recent events have shown. So they have shown that there is, if you like, a force, just as their brothers and sisters in Egypt and Tunisia have also shown that action can be taken. That in this new scramble, the people of Africa also have a say. It's not just a question of what the big powers, the big multinationals want. That people aren't confused by the propaganda, by the sweet words and so on. That people are prepared to take action. And I think then that is also a message to us, that we should also play our part. It's not as we're just passive observers of what the big powers are doing, because they are our governments. Are these things being done in our name? If they're not being done in our name, then what is our view? What are we saying about it? What are we doing about it? Do we agree that this scramble should go on, should take place in the way that it is taking place? Or do we think that the governments of Canada, the big monopolies of Canada, of Britain, of the US, of France, of Belgium should act in a different way, or shouldn't act at all? So we also have to consider what our role is in dealing with these particular problems. And on that note, I'll stop.